Welcome to the Celtic Star Podcast, a Celtic State of Mind. My name's Paul John Dykes, and as always, I'm joined with my cohort, Kevin Graham.
Hello.
It's been nearly 25 years since the Celtic takeover, and this week we have invited a key player onto the show. Thank you for joining us, David Lowe.
Hi, great to be here.
Now, David, if we can first of all go back to your younger days, what are your memories of being introduced to Celtic?
Well, that's quite a while ago now because I'm sort of pretty old now. No, I was born in 1958 and saw my first Celtic game in 1966, which wasn't at home. It was at Motherwell, and it was a brilliant one because it was the game that Celtic won to win the first of the 9. And it was taken there as my first Celtic game, but it wasn't my first football game. My first football game was Thurlanark versus Aberdeen in 1965 because my mother didn't want me involved in all that Celtic Rangers Catholic Protestant thing, and she forced my father, who was from Govan, to take me there, much to his annoyance. Anyway, I almost said thankfully they went bust. I shouldn't really say that, but they did go bust in 1966, and the rest is history, I suppose.
So that's a good introduction, obviously the first of the 9. And were you a regular visitor to Celtic Park for the next 9 years?
Well, my father was, and therefore he took me. So when he could get into the stand, he took me because there only was a rickety old stand, I suppose you would call it, and there wasn't a lot of seats in it. So if it wasn't a big game, he would take me there because he wouldn't take me to the terracing. But all I remember is good things because this is when Jock Stein came in. Celtic were pretty awful. I've got a guy sits next to me in the stand just now, Peter Riley. He was in his 70s. He's quite a well-known guy, brilliant guy, and he'll tell you about how rubbish it was pre-Jock Stein. Celtic hadn't won anything since the 7-1 game, I think, against Rangers in the League Cup final. So I sort of came in at a very good time. Celtic were on the up. One of my first memories was my father and his mates coming back from Liverpool saying they was robbed, and they had a goal disallowed 10 minutes to go, I think it was, and
Bobby Lennox,
and that was 2-0, and we went out. So they all come back drunk, swearing and all that, and that was what would I be, 8? I remember that. So there you go.
It's nice to hear that Celtic European away trips haven't changed.
I mean, we will go on to your later years back in the 90s, but you've seen the best of times, and as a Celtic fan. Now, the other element really of your later involvement is your financial background. So what was your introduction into the financial world?
Well, I sort of stumbled into the financial world by accident, found that I liked it, and sort of started doing pretty well out of it, I suppose. And I ended up being an investment analyst, which sort of is someone that reverse engineers balance sheets. So numbers, profit and loss accounts, balance sheets are sort of pretty normal for me. And it sort of was my first job being an investment analyst. So that gave me a sort of grounding in finance, and I sort of progressed to do other things. But that financial knowledge, allied with my interest in football, was sort of instrumental in me taking a close look at Celtic, I suppose, in the 1980s, because right up until the mid-80s, there was no debt in Scottish football. Everybody lived within their means. Big clubs with more revenues, like Rangers, Celtic, had more money, had better players and won more things, but everybody essentially lived within their own means. And Rangers won more than Celtic, but both together won more than everybody else. But even in my time as a young kid, Kilmarnock, Dundee won the league and Hearts won the league maybe. And in the 1980s, when it wasn't really all about money, you had the new firm, and Aberdeen and Dundee United won the league. But all that changed in the late 80s when David Murray came in, and he introduced a bank debt to Scottish football for the first time. And that's when I started to take notice, basically.
When you started to have a closer look at Celtic's finances, David, what did you discover?
Well, I discovered very quickly they were in a serious financial mess, which was only going to get worse. Because I did recognise at the time that debt was playing a more important role in football as a financial guy. Rangers had gone out and borrowed $5 million when they threw out the old board. Well, it all started in 1986. Rangers hadn't won anything since, from memory, 1977, and there was a takeover, and a new board came in 1986, and they gave the new guy, Souness, an overdraft, and he started spending it, and they got a whole lot of good players from England because England were banned from playing in Europe, so he got the England captain and Terry Butcher and a bunch of others, so that really gave them a head start over Celtic at the time, but it wasn't really that bad. The other big advantage Rangers had was they had a stadium which didn't need a lot of money spent on it, and therefore all the money they generated could go into the team. Celtic, on the other hand, had no entrepreneurial flair, no money, a rickety old stand that held 8,000. They got into debt for the first time to build the bit in the front of the main stand. I think in 1988, £2 million. And they basically were not in a position to compete with this new threat across the city. So I sort of noticed that, but didn't really pay that much attention to it because I was doing other things. Wasn't living in Glasgow, was doing a lot of travelling. But progressively things got worse. Celtic trying to imitate Rangers without the entrepreneurial flair, if we're being generous, that David Murray had, without the access to the bank that David Murray had. And they were all making a living out of the club, which wasn't really to the same extent at Rangers. So Celtic sort of started copying Rangers they had their own Souness in the form of Brady, but he was an inexperienced manager and that didn't work out. And they started spending more than they could earn. So Celtic went into debt and were always going to be at best second best. And, I said, this is probably going to get worse. But again, I didn't do anything about it till I moved back to Glasgow in the early 90s.
Right. So in the late 80s, you identified the precarious situation that Celtic were in as early as that. And I believe at that time, although he enters the main story a wee bit later, Fergus McCann tried to get involved around about 1988. Is that right?
Well, roughly the same time, yeah. I had noticed there had been a change. The dynamic had changed. In the early 80s, everybody lived within their means. In the late 80s, people were starting to borrow money, and Rangers had more of everything, and therefore the gap was opening up. So beyond that, that's what I noticed. I wasn't planning to do anything about it at the time because I was doing other things, but the change in the game happened in the 1980s with the takeover at Rangers in 86, and then all the gears went up again when Murray came in 88. Now,
when you eventually did get involved, David, can you tell me how that transpired and how that materialised?
Yep. So in 1990, I took over. I became chairman of a company called Bremner, and it had a stockbroking subsidiary, which for lots of reasons I decided to shut down. But when I was in the process of shutting it down, I got this little bit of paper from California. It was from a Graham Kelly, who was a relation of the Kellys, and he stayed in Oceanside, California. I always remember that. And in this letter he said, my great-grandfather, was part of the founders of Celtic Football Club, but he wanted to now sell his shares in the Celtic organisation. And I wanted to buy them because they were like gold dust. So I was employing Michael Kelly at the time as a PR guy, and there was another seismic event, that made me sit up and take notice really, and that was the board at this time knew they had problems. The old boys had all died off. Desmond White was gone, Bob Kelly was gone, and they did, to their credit, or a faction on the board, to their credit, said we need some new blood in here. And they appointed Brian Dempsey as an NED, a non-executive director, and Michael Kelly, who I was actually employing at the time. Then, out of the blue, and I still wasn't paying attention to what was going on at Celtic. I was just going to games, really. And then, out of the blue, they pulled a stroke on Dempsey, by getting him removed from the board. And I thought, wow, that's pretty heavy stuff. That's stuff that I usually do. What are you doing that for? And he gave me a bit of blarney. Michael Kelly, I'm talking about Dempsey. So I remember telling Michael Kelly, you've set a precedent here. You've introduced the corporate world to Celtic, and unless you know what you're doing and unless you've got solutions to the problems, you've basically opened up Pandora's box here, because that type of behaviour could come back to haunt you. And funnily enough, it did. And it did involve me, so there you go.
Now, what we eventually had there, David, was we had the Biscuit Tin Board and the Rebels, if you like.
Yeah.
So could you tell me how the Rebels got together and devised the plan to try and start building up some shareholding?
Well, this is a few years on now, so I think Brian got papped off the board in 1991 or something like that. And I came back to Glasgow. So I'd had a very good 1980s, and I decided I only wanted to get involved in things that I enjoyed. One was football, and funnily enough, one was music. You know, I'm sitting in the recording studio here. So I took a very close look at Celtic. There was a perception that Celtic were owned or controlled by a little old lady in Ireland. But I, being an analyst, I just never take anything. I never accept anything as gospel. I'm the doubting Thomas. I've always got to work it out for myself or check it and see if it stacks up. So I commissioned from Companies House all these Celtic accounts, all these share registers, and sort of reverse engineered it again and put all the shareholders reassembled them all. And I sort of basically discovered there was a little old lady, but the little old lady called Felicia Grant had sort of died sometime in the 70s, I think. And she had, Tom Grant's father had inherited half of them. Quarter of them had gone to 5 different members of her family in Toombridge, County Antrim, and another quarter had been split 5 ways into her further extended family in and around Toronto. So when you put all that together, that was a huge holding. I did other sort of stuff and sort of basically came to the conclusion that, hey, these guys don't control Celtic. What they have is a non-aggression pact amongst themselves. And it had 3 groups. It had the Kelly group, which in itself consisted of a lot of family members. It had Desmond White's son. Forgotten his name now. He's been away for so long. What was his name?
Chris.
Yeah, Chris White. There you go.
Right,
it's 25 years after all. And then there was Tom Grant, who had inherited the shares from his family. So that was like an axis of 3 families. And Tom had been invited onto the board because if you aggregate their holdings, that came to like 60%. And then the other 40% were basically dismissed as being irrelevant. So that's what I discovered. But also discovered, because I'd done this before in other companies, that if you go and speak to those shareholders, give them a plan and they like the plan, they'll support you. And if they don't support you, you can buy their shares off them. So that was my plan, basically. That was the rudiments of the plan. So, but I was just a guy on my own. I didn't hang about with all the cognoscenti and hang around in boardrooms. So I didn't really know any of the other guys. And like Dempsey and Fergus, because Fergus had been around making offers to the board because he saw a problem as well in the late 80s. And they kept asking him when his next flight home was. So nothing was happening. Anyway, I was actually introduced to Brian Dempsey by a third party by accident. And I said, hey, sorry to hear about you getting papped off the board. And he said, yeah, and they're terrible people. And I said, well, what are you going to do about it? He said, I don't know. They've got it all sewn up. I said, well, I've got a cunning plan. And I sort of told him what that plan was. So he introduced me to a bunch of other people and said I should meet this strange guy in Canada called Fergus McCann, who had the money and seemed pretty determined to do something about it. So through that connection, one by one, you basically bumped into all the names you'll be familiar with. None of us really got on that much. The only thing we had in common was the Celtic thing. Everybody's personalities were different. They all wanted different things out of it. But, a group did emerge, and that's the backdrop to how we all came together. So I basically made arrangements to go and see Fergus, who was in Montreal at the time. I remember that meeting clearly. It was a great meeting. I love the guy because he's so straightforward. Anyway, I went to see him in his apartment, and he said, "Sit down, Mr. Lowe. Who are you? Why are you here? And what do you want?" And that's verbatim. And he made me this cup of coffee, and it was brimming to the top. And I was concentrating not to spill it over his nice carpet, which I didn't do. But anyway, I told him the plan, and it was like the plan was to go and speak to all the shareholders, tell them that Celtic was going down the toilet. We had to do something about it. We had a plan that involved putting £14 million into it. We had management that would make it happen, and one of two things always happened. Well, three things happened. The first thing that would always happen is, delighted to see you, because we think the board are awful. They treat us awfully. We never hear anything. They don't keep us in the loop. We feel like second, third-class citizens. If you're going to do this, best of luck, and you have our support. And all of them did that. A few of them weren't interested, and when they weren't interested, you just made them an offer for their shares, and a lot of them accepted that. But very quickly, we made a lot of progress.
And I think you got up to the stage of around 40%.
Yeah, so it started off when I met Fergus in Canada. He said, it's a great plan, Mr. Law, but it's not for me. All the money I have, I'm putting into the club. I'm not giving any of these guys any of my money at all. I'm not going to reward them for putting the club in this state. So good luck. If you succeed, come to me first, because I'm the man that'll put the money into the club. So again, that's brilliant news, because where you stand with Fergus from day one to today. So the other guy I saw at the time was Jim Doherty, who is a second cousin of Tom Grant. He's one of the 5 that got shares from the little old lady Felicia's in Tunbridge as well. So he loved it. He rounded up his aunties and his cousins, all 5 of them, and we all sat round a table, and he pledged unwavering allegiance to the rebels. So in one visit, we were up to 8%, with quite easily. He then came over to Tunbridge with me and introduced me to his cousins round a wee table, Coke with no ice, and they were the same, unwavering, supportive of what we were doing. So 2 visits and we're well over 10%, 15%. Then there was Betty Devlin, Tom Devlin's wife. I think Tom had died in 1986, and the board didn't really treat her with any respect at all, and she thought they were useless, so she had a huge holding. She pledged support. There was a few others we bought shares off. So we've gone from 0 to 40% in a couple of months. And I'm pretty sure we can go over 51%. If we get over 51%, we basically control the club, and we can throw out directors, put new guys on, have a rights issue, raise money, do all the things we eventually ended up doing. And Fergus would come in. But when you're doing this type of thing, you're starting off with big holdings, and you're working your way through a shareholder list, and each time the shareholdings get smaller. Each time there's less research and knowledge about who you're cold calling. You don't know whether they're going to support you or whether they're going to go run into the board and say, hey, this guy Lowell visited me and he wants to throw you guys out. And that's exactly what happened. So it was actually Tom in here the other week. They said, well, we're going to see this person, and because they want to support what we're doing. So we went and saw this person, who shall remain nameless, and they did say they supported what we were doing. And then when they left, they called the board and supported them. And it was at that point that the board knew that Tom, at this moment in time anyway, was one of the rebels Tom Grant was talking about. And it was at that point that they called their own general meeting to remove Tom and Jimmy Farrell from the board. Again, pretty heavy corporate stuff, but I'm a pretty heavy corporate person myself, so I'm more experienced in this than they are, and we've sort of won that vote because Tom and Jimmy stayed on the board, although Tom unfortunately signed another non-aggression pact with the board, one of the daftest things he's done, which set us back temporarily from a position whereby we could have taken over the club, I'm pretty sure, very quickly. We ended up at war for almost 2 years exactly, because this is 92 and we strolled into, 4th of March, 1994, before we finally succeeded.
It came to a head in November 93 at the AGM, where they just put forward an investment plan of over 17 million.
Yep, that's right. So, and we lost that, but I wanted to lose it. That might seem strange. So the board at this point were in such a bad state that to stay in business, they needed money, and they didn't have any money. And if you get no money, you basically have no future, certainly in football. So they'd also maxed out their overdraft limit, which I think from memory was like 5 million quid. So when we called that meeting, and I think you only need 10% at the time, it's 5% now, but with 10% of a shareholding, you can call a general meeting. So we called this general meeting to invest the money in Celtic, in the full knowledge that they would almost certainly knock it back, which is what I wanted, because what that means is if they're going to knock back all that money, they can only knock it back if they have an alternative, another source of money, which they didn't. So I said, no, they're going to knock this back, and the first call they're going to get is from the bank saying, what you doing? And that's what happened. So they lit the touch fuse for their own demise by not coming to an accommodation, not coming to an agreement, or not having a plan. So the beginning of the end, the true beginning of the end for the Celtic board at the time was the day that they won the EGM.
Who brung the wind of change then? What members of the board who were against you to start off with then jumped ship?
Well, jumping ship's pejorative. Tom probably set things back, by signing what I call the non-aggression pact. But at the end of the day, when the opportunity came to finally take it over, he pledged his shares on our side. So I'm not saying anything bad. I'm just talking matter of fact, because that's what happened.
Mm-hmm.
So they ran out of money, and the board I'm talking about ran out of money, literally. Wages couldn't be paid. They were being asked for personal guarantees. These were not wealthy people. Without Celtic, they were just ordinary guys you'd see in the street. And I could understand to a degree, why they were loath to give it away, because it's the only thing of any consequence that they distinguished them from anybody else. And if they no longer had it, what did they have? So I appreciated that, but so what? We don't support families, we support Celtic. So. Mm-hmm. And that's the way it had to be. So there was two factions on the board. There was the Michael Kelly, Chris White, David Dallas Smith guy who appeared from somewhere. And there was what I call the real Celtic supporters on the board, the guys that still go and see Celtic, like Tom and Kevin Kelly and Jack McGinn. I could say lots of bad things about them, but I would never say they're not genuine Celtic fans, because they could have cashed in their money and made a bit of money. They could have sold their shares and never be seen again at Celtic Support, as some of the guys that sold out did. But at the end of the day, the bad faction on the board, if we can call them that, tried to cobble a deal together, with Gerald Weisfeld and Willie Hockey. Now, Willie and I got on very well, but not at the time we didn't, because our plan won and his didn't. But, I was out with him last week at the Marina Douglas charity do, and, it was brilliant fun, So we're all older and wiser, and there's no bad blood anywhere. So, but at the time, a faction in the board knew that it was over for them and tried to cobble a deal together with Weisfeld and Willie. But, there wasn't really a plan. It was just taking over the overdraft, putting benches and the terrace and messing about, Nobody had the vision, the focus, the determination, the capital that Fergus had. And the faction of the board were not really interested in dealing with Gerald. So they came to us, and so they were almost like blackmailed into accepting a deal. Like, if you don't accept this, we're bust, and it's over, and we can't have that. So what I did was tell them to don't go and sign anything, don't do anything. We'll go and see the bank, And it was actually a guy called Dominic Keane that went to see the bank, and the bank said they wanted $1 million within 48 hours and another $4 million within a week. Otherwise, they were going to appoint a receiver, that's what you called it back then, rather than an administrator. Mm-hmm. So, and everybody knew about this. So I called Fergus, who was playing golf in Phoenix, Arizona, and said, hey, your time's come. They're bust. They're going to close the doors. They want $1 million within 48 hours. And you got to send it now, or the opportunity to fix this is gone. So it wasn't like just now. We didn't have any backs transfers whereby zillions go across the world in seconds. This was like go to the bank, fill in a form. Anyway, he did two things. He instructed the money to go from like New York, London, Glasgow, and he got off the golf course, and then he started organising flights, and he got here before the money did. So Fergus basically transferred £1 million. The bank got it in time. I actually signed the papers with him, and that's where that 8-minute story comes in, because we met at the airport and then went to the Bank of Scotland in St Vincent Street, and we weren't running. We were walking pretty fast though. And all the papers get signed at 11:52, and the bank got their money. Now you got to remember that's like investing blind, £1 million with no paperwork, no contract, no positions on the board.
It's a gamble, eh?
It's one hell of a £1 million gamble. In fact, it's crazy. But then Fergus is crazy, isn't he? Crazy good. But, it's not something a lot of people would do. Lots of other people had the chance to do it. There's people sitting in Glasgow that could have done it, and maybe for legitimate reasons didn't. But it's important to contextualise how crazy it was, as was the subsequent $4 million, which they did get, 5 days later. But all that meant was that Fergus McCann became the unsecured creditor of Celtic, with no positions in the board, no shareholding, no control, no nothing. So what then followed was heavy negotiations at Celtic Park in the rain. That's what came next.
Mm-hmm. The demand for £1 million, David, that was a direct result of the failed EGM.
You could trace it back there. I mean, like I said, when our proposal at the EGM was to put money into the club, the board knocked that back. So when they knocked it back, the bank called them up and said, well, what are you going to do then? Because you can't go on like this. So I've no doubts they tried to get money, but 4 months later they had run out of money, so they didn't get the money. And because they didn't get the money, the show was over. So they then went to Gerald, to cobble together a plan, and you had all these daft conversations. Well, we'll deal with you if we can get 3 seats on the board and fly with the team plane and all that malarkey. But it didn't really solve the problem. Celtic were in a horrible state. You had the Taylor report kicking in. We had no seats, no money, no team.
Stadium was a dump.
Everything was bad. Rangers were, so far ahead at the time that it was pretty bleak. And if you go back to when I started supporting Celtic, I was well into my 20s before I realised we weren't winning the European Cup again. So that's because that's what I was used to. So it was pretty bleak and pretty bad being a Celtic fan at the time. It was as rubbish as rubbish gets, although I'm sure Rangers fans just now feel a lot worse.
Yeah, it's just going back to
because they're a lot further behind us than we were to them
at that time.
The
reason I ask about the £1 million is there is, obviously with hindsight now, we know the insidious relationships that were going on between Rangers and the bank, and there is a notion that they were playing hardball with Celtic as a direct result of that relationship. Would you state that it was more to do with the EGM and the result of that EGM? Yeah,
I know there are some people that say Celtic, the bank treated Celtic or were prejudiced or biased against Celtic. Well, they weren't. They just weren't. Celtic were playing just old-fashioned bust. Rangers were playing old-fashioned bust. They did the same to Rangers, 1986. Rangers had run out of, 1988. Rangers had run out of money in 1988. David Holmes had spent all that money as Suarez and Butcher. They'd run out of money, and that was a sort of forced sale when they'd maxed out their OD. So in that respect, Celtic, were no different in '94, and I don't subscribe for one moment to the view that the forces in Scotland conspired against Celtic to see them off. I don't buy that at all. In fact, it's not true. The change at Celtic came about simply because they ran out of money. That's why it happened. And the bank was prepared to use the same mechanism to get their money back, and that is force a receivership or an administration, you'd call it just now, to bring in new management with new money and new expertise. So that's what happened. Celtic ran out of money, and you can't, if you've got no money. The point I'm making is you can't knock money back unless you've got an alternative. That's why losing the EGM in November was tactically sensible, and rather than winning it, would have been good as well. But it was actually losing it which was the beginning of the end for the board. Yeah,
another big facet of the story. Talking about financial analyst, big investor, and then the tactic that was successful was the fans knew that there was a problem, and the fans were able to organise themselves into a movement.
Yeah.
How important do you think that was, that Matt McGlone and his cohorts, Brendan Sweeney, etc., formed Celts for Change, were very organised and got a huge amount of backing from fellow supporters?
Well, I think it was very important, and I think it hastened the end. The money side was always going to solve the problem. A street movement on its own is not going to solve the problem. It's money that solves the problem. But if fans, or as banks see them, customers, are demonstrating in the street and withholding their money, from the club, making the situation more acute, that's definitely going to facilitate change. So they played a very important role in bringing about change or hastening change, and I don't think anybody would really deny that.
Also with the share issue, sometimes Fergus rightly gets credit for the share issue, but I think a lot of the credit has to go to the fans, because we made that two of the most successful share issues ever.
Yeah. If you were interviewing Fergus McCann, he would say that. In fact, he'll tell you, you remember looking out the window, Terry Casty's old office, and it dawned on him for the first time the quantum of the responsibility that he'd taken on. There was a big queue winding round the street with people holding cheques, putting money into the club. And he actually told me at that moment, that was the first time I felt nervous about what I was doing, because I have this responsibility not to let all these people down. So what happened when there was a change is, if you can imagine, like the genie was out the bottle, all this pent-up enthusiasm was suddenly rushing, adrenaline rush right through the whole support, and it was a massive success on the back of a bad victory in, I think it was the League Cup final.
Could beat off.
And there had to be an extended second issue. So, Celtic fans, stepped up in a very big way to support this rebirth of the club. And I don't think anybody would deny that, fans played a key part in the success that followed.
I remember when the share issue came out, it came out the day after we got beat off Raith Rovers in the League Cup final at Ibrox. And I remember getting the application pack through my door.
Aye.
And having a look at it, and I'm going, I was in a very poorly paid job at the time, and I'm having a look at this application, and I'm like, do I continue to go to the football or do I buy shares?
Aye.
And that was a decision that I had to make. And my decision was, I backed Fergus to rebuild Celtic Park, and I continued going to the football. I bought a season ticket. Mm-hmm. First time ever I bought a season ticket, and I'm still a season ticket holder to this day. But I know of stories of Celtic fans in the exact same position as me who could put themselves into debt to buy the shares, and they didn't think twice about it. And I think that's fantastic. Did you underestimate what was going to happen? The demand, the will and the want of the Celtic support.
Underestimate. No, I mean, it was always part. Fergus McCann did have a plan, and that plan from the very beginning was always to offer shares to the fans, to be there for 5 years, and at the end of 5 years, offer his half to the other half. That was always the plan. He's a pretty precise guy. And he didn't say he was going to be there forever. He had no idea what the prices were going to be. Nobody's in control of these things. But the plan did involve him having control. He had to have control because this is part of the problem at Rangers just now. There's tough decisions to get made. Unpleasant decisions. Decisions you're going to get criticised for. Decisions that a lot of people won't understand. You had to have focus, determination and control so that whenever big issues come up, you always knew you could get them through because you had 51%. 50%. So his plan always insisted on 51% for Fergus with real money that he puts in. And all he was asking the fans to do is to put the same amount or a similar amount of money in for the 49%. He would do the job, which is build a stadium, build a team, then go. Guess what he did? He did that, and then he went. So it always involved the fans. The fans' role was always important. To take it a stage further, I think everybody underestimated the level of support that the fans would bring to that share issue. That's why they had to extend it and have more. And the fans played a very big part in the rebirth of the football club.
If we take a wee step back, David, back to that rainy night in March 1994, and there was the iconic moment, the war is over, the rebels have won. Where were you at that point?
Well, I was in the building trying to buy shares off the Whites and the Kellys for nada, but they weren't having it. They were going nowhere unless they get their wedge. So, and that was a tough decision because, again, I remember what happens, because you've got to remember Fergus said these guys are getting nothing. And I was pretty hard line as well. Why give them any money? When they've got the club into this state. So we put them all in different rooms, a police interrogation, I guess, try and get different results out of them. But at the end of the day, they wanted money, so we gave them a cake, a financial cake. And I said, there's a cake. You can take any slice you want, and that's all you're getting. And Fergus was still for giving them nothing. But I said, look, this is once in a lifetime. You're in a pretty exposed position. They've got to get something. So he said, okay. It's one of the 2 times I can remember getting him to change his mind. So money did change hands for shares. That allowed the board to change. That allowed shareholdings to convert debt to equity. It was very important, and the guys that got the money resigned. But again, I don't think this has appeared anywhere. There's a lot of people that supported these people that wanted to sell their shares, but there was nothing left for them because the slices taken were so big. So that allowed Gerald Weisfeld to come in and buy their shares. So he ended up buying a blocking stake. Now, a blocking stake is a stake of 25% that can prevent certain resolutions getting passed. Resolutions such as converting debt to equity, resolutions of issuing more shares. So I had to negotiate with Gerald Weisfeld, to get his support, to support the plans for Celtic. And I remember he was in Los Angeles at the time, and I had to have this all-night meeting with his lawyer and Gerald in the conference call, and it lasted all night. And I dozed off, thinking I was going to go to I think it was Celtic St Johnstone game, and woke up the Sunday morning and found out Celtic had won. But Gerald's price for supporting the deal was to put Michael McDonald and Willie Hockey onto the board, and he lent them both £500,000 each. Michael's still there, and Willie's not.
David, when did your time come to an end at Celtic Park then? After all this hard work, after all the blood, sweat and tears, when did you decide that it was time to go back to supporting the club?
Well, my original plan was to stay for the duration with Fergus, because at the end of the day, all that would... I remember sitting at Terry Cassidy's desk. I was a consultant, or agreed to do some consultancy stuff for Celtic whilst Fergus was there. I remember on day one thinking, God, what happens next? I guess Chris, what's his name? Craig White must have felt the same. What next? And I remember one of the first things I found is that Celtic owned 5,000 Rangers shares. So just like Craigie, I sold them, although his were Arsenal shares. But no, I remember thinking, God, what a mess, because there had been no opportunity to do any diligence. You didn't really know what you'd bought, but what you'd bought was in a bit of a state. We didn't have any seats, for the Taylor report, and had to hire Hamden and stuff like that. No, it was a huge job to get done. And anyway, I ended up staying as a consultant. That's what your question was. And one of the things I did was do all these road shows, and had to turn up in front of all these hostile audiences, guys shouting at you, going, "Give the canny on the money, give him the money, give him what he wants." And nobody could understand, everybody just wanted to do what Rangers were doing, which is borrowing money and spending money you didn't have. And remember, Fergus got booed because he was making all these tough decisions. At the end of the day, if you have to have the infrastructure in place before you can start spending the money. So you had to build the stadium, that cost money. You had to finish paying for it. And only when that stadium was bought and paid for would all your cash flow be able to go into the team. But try explaining that to a bunch of guys in Garngad, when the Rangers are on 8 in a row, or a bunch of drunk guys at a Vegas convention. Anyway, that's what I did. I was sort of the frontline sort of defender of the faith.
Now, I know there's been obviously a lot of other people involved since then, David, but when you look at the success of Celtic, cash-rich, invincible last season, do you feel in many ways this is a legacy of Fergus McCann's takeover?
To a degree, but I think the problems facing Celtic now are far bigger than they were in the period that we've just been talking about. Celtic are now unassailably and forevermore, all things being equal, in a league of their own. Rangers are far further behind Celtic just now than Celtic ever were back in the 1990s. And that's unhealthy, being so far ahead financially. There's not really any serious competition. The outlook for the Scottish League is awful. The gap in Europe, and I'm a guy that, remember, is used to winning things in Europe, seeing Celtic in quarterfinals, semi-finals, 2 finals, and it's just not acceptable to me and lots of people of my age that support Celtic to see us so far behind these mediocre teams, English teams, never mind European ones, simply because we don't have access to television money. So I think the outlook for Celtic's, if you're ambitious and you want your team to do well in Europe, is not very good. And it's a big problem, but it's been a problem for years, and it's a problem that's not going to go away. Being the biggest, most successful team in Scotland, it shouldn't be the ambition of Celtic. It should be a lot more than that, sorry.
Do you think, how does Celtic change that then? Is it only if the UEFA eventually allow cross-border competition?
Well, yeah, it's the UEFA rules are all set up to prevent that. There's special rules in place for like the Welsh, Derry plays in the Republic, Monaco plays in France, Berwick play in Scotland. There's these special provisions for these guys, but they protect the football jurisdictions very closely. They don't want Celtic playing in England or Ajax playing in Germany or Porto playing in La Liga, and they've got rules to prevent that. And lots of people have taken lots of legal advice on this, but the legal advice is that, if you don't like the rules, put a resolution forward to change the rules and don't go to court. So I don't think there's a lot of prospect of, Celtic playing in England. There's a possibility of, Atlantic League type things coming up, but there's nothing in the horizon that I'm aware of.
For me, I think we're closer to having a look at the European results this week, when you see Liverpool going to Porto winning quite comfortably, Man City going to Bâle winning quite comfortably, PSG coming to Celtic and beating us quite comfortably as well, I think the elite clubs will push for change, and an Atlantic League or a second tier European league is now on the horizon. That's what I think. Anyway.
Yeah, there may well be change, but you really want Celtic to be playing against Paris and Madrid with the same budget, the same television money, rather than some inferior, Northern Atlantic League against teams like Ajax or Chelsea, which are wee clubs as well with a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today, David. It's been an absolute insight into, one of the most interesting and depressing but then magical times in Celtic history for me.
Thanks very much, David.
No problem.
A Celtic State of Mind's previous episodes can be accessed by searching iTunes, Spreaker or your pre-installed podcast player. Make sure to subscribe and you won't miss our upcoming episodes with former players, musical icons, documentary makers and Celtic supporters. You can keep up to date with us and get in touch at Paul Dykes, at A Northern Pros and at Celtic Star Pod. We also have a new website, www.thecelticstar.com, and on that website we have a host of writers giving you daily Celtic news, including Jim Craig, who gives a morning blog. We also have contributors such as myself, Kevin Graham, David Potter and Scotty Allcroft. Tune in next week. We will have another guest with a Celtic State of Mind.